Okay, good morning. I think we'll kick off now and people will be joining in as we go along. We're here today to talk about how can international innovation be practically incorporated into Australia business operations. Many people in the Australian sector now are going overseas or looking globally for solutions, and in today's Australian global environment, there's a rapidly expanding variety of seniors living and aged care models. They're emerging to meet evolving consumer expectations, reform agendas, our own government agendas, and a desire by operators to create alternative aged care and senior living models. So what we want to do today is talk to an expert panel of industry executives who have travelled overseas and internationally, and talk to them about how they, or have they, been able to bring those business learnings back into both their own businesses and have any impact on the Australian scenario. To kick off our segment for Anchor Excellence, I'd like to acknowledge country. And in the spirit of reconciliation, the Anchor Excellence team and myself acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We and I pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. Our expert panel that are going to be presenting to you today and talking about their lived experience are a very senior group of executives. A lot of them are known to many of you. Those that aren't, please take the opportunity to jot down their name and their title if you wanted to connect with them after the webinar or follow up. My name's Judy Martin. I'm the Executive Lead for SAGE International Study Tours and Industry Advisor for Anchor Excellence. I've been running the SAGE International Study Tour program for over 18 years. I was a founding board director of the Commonwealth Association of Ageing, establishing an association specifically for Commonwealth countries around the globe. And I'm the immediate past chair and current board director of the Global Ageing Network out of Washington, which represents aged care providers internationally and Peak Industry Association internationally. We have Alan Waters joining us today. He is the General Manager, Residential and Retirement from Baptist Care New South Wales. Jo Boylan joining us from South Australia. She's the CEO of Clayton Church Homes. Pino Gentile is a Principal and Seniors Living Specialist for Thomson Adset, and Thomson Adset were the former owners of the SAGE Industry Study Program and are delighted to be the diamond partners of the SAGE program now that the ownership's moved over to Anchor Excellence. And we have Tammy Sherwood, the CEO of Australia New Zealand Person-Centred Software and Centrum. So I'd like to kick off first by talking to you, Jo, and asking you, we know, or many people know, that you're in your role as CEO and in your previous roles, you have been an absolute advocate of healthy ageing, particularly under the UN standards around a healthy ageing decade. And you've known to have done some very exciting work in this area, particularly where SAGE has been previously, to South Africa and around the globe in the more developed countries. You've joined a number of study tour programs over the years, and I wanted to ask you today, particularly with your focus of that healthy ageing, but how has the international connections you've made or participating in study tours with colleagues assisted you implementing some of these healthy ageing models, noting it's very important that in Australia, some would argue that our funding model actually doesn't assist to fund healthy ageing, it actually funds disablement, which is a very contentious point that is often discussed. So Jo, I'll give you a couple of minutes to talk about your experience both as a senior executive and then when you transition to a CEO and how those learnings have been able to be implemented, if indeed they have.
Thank you, Judy. And again, thank you for the opportunity to speak with everyone about my experience on your amazing SAGE tours. Firstly, your coordination and leadership on these tours enables all participants to receive such quality exposure to innovation in aged care. That is, I can't describe enough how valuable that is. You skillfully chose and coordinated countries and organisations that would challenge our thinking, and that's, really that's what the tour is all about. So for over the last 30 years, I've been advocating for a healthy ageing model of care in aged care, establishing gyms and strength-based exercise a strength-based exercise approach wherever I go. So that's been in 3 or 4 organisations now. So the 3 sage tours I participated in and led by yourself gave me exceptional learnings and reflections on how other people and other countries approach aged care and how I could shape things differently when returning back to my work. I was particularly impressed with the care farms in the Netherlands. Can you remember that one, Alan and Judy? I mean, that was extraordinary, just extraordinary. These models are predominantly focused on people living with dementia and the integration of farm life and the routine of care of animals and gardens that gave every person a sense of purpose and a lot of joy. You know, we could see in the faces a lot of joy in these people. Health promotion, mobility and well-being were also at the essence of this approach. And I came away feeling that this was really providing a great life for older people. This is a model that I've yet to implement and is ideal for future planning in Australia. So in the Netherlands, there's nearly 1,200 care farms, and I'm not sure how many are in Australia. So this is something that we can look at. So in regard, Judy, to my visit in South Africa, this came about through meeting another colleague of ours who presented at many of the SAGE-related conferences and was so wishing that they could, in South Africa, afford and have gyms in their homes like we were. So with sponsorship from Southern Cross Care SA and Mercy Health in Victoria, I was able to travel to South Africa and meet up with my colleague and establish gyms into 2 quite poor aged care homes. One was an Afrikaans home located outside of Cape Town, and another predominantly a Zulu home run by Catholic nuns located some distance from Durban. Neither of these homes thought that a gym could ever be possible for them and were so grateful for this gift. In the Zulu home, they used to go to church and then go to the gym, all in the same room. Fantastic. So in summary, I can only explain that I'm better informed and an enlightened person for having been on these tours and have always returned to innovate and transform to better practice in South Australia in particular. And thank you, Judy, for your extraordinary leadership advocating for our Australian aged care approach.
Thanks, Jo. What is really interesting is when we first did a study tour to the Netherlands nearly 17 years ago, there were 2 care farms in the Netherlands. When we went back over 10 years later, there were 1,200 care farms in the Netherlands, and a CEO from Australia came back and did indeed implement a care farm up in Queensland, and another delegate that came overseas to look at best practice implemented a care farm in Victoria. What was sad was when those 2 senior execs left the organisation, it folded. But what to me that brought about was it was people who had the learning. So part of the importance of learning is bringing and transitioning your messages back to your team. And that brings me to you, Alan, where I know you've participated, in a number of SAGE programs, both with Australian executives, as well as taking a little group from your own organisation as part of a bigger group on a couple of trips. I wanted to ask you, Alan, what value you see in both going with on your own or with a small group or with a larger group. What are the benefits to those? And if you could talk to that as an Australian executive, because today is how have we brought the messages back to Australia, and can we implement things that we learn from other organisations in other countries? And I want to talk to you about the value for money in that, because everyone's budgeting. How hard have you had to work when you came home to implement models that were a little bit out of the box or people might have challenged you on? And how important is it to you as in your own professional development in looking outward for ideas to bring back to care and Australia?
Thanks, Judy. Have I got sound now? Yeah. First, can I just echo Joe's comments about how well run I found the SAGE programs. So after the first one, I was really committed to doing more of them to learn more around the world. And it's because everything for me was taken care of. All of the travel arrangements beforehand and the getting to and from all of the events, really well managed. And so I've been on other things that haven't been quite so well managed, but the SAGE ones I've been really impressed with all the way through. So thank you to Judy for all of her skill in that space. For me, the personal development and the things you see, as Joe was saying, it causes you to rethink some of your positions. And I've got a couple of examples of them, of things that I've changed since going on study tours. And they might sound simple, but they make a big difference to organisations down the track. And the first one, when we were talking about this before, that sprang to mind was pets in aged care homes and pets in retirement villages. The provider I was with at the time, the prevailing wisdom was people don't want pets in aged care and people don't want pets in retirement villages. And we didn't have them. There was a policy that you couldn't even have a goldfish. That's how strict the no pet policy was. But travelling overseas, we went to multiple places where there were pets in high rises, there were pets in villas, there were pets in standalone places, pets in aged care homes. And it changed my thinking from how do we move from a no pet policy and a strict one at that to the next thing we build is going to be pet friendly. And with the provider at the time, we did that. And it made a huge difference. For our retirement village, we learned through a bit of research we did, Jude, that it increased the number of people willing to move into retirement villages by 30%. And I can't think of another thing that we could have done that would have exposed us to a wider market. And at the same time, made quality of life for the people in retirement villages better. So there's lots of things, some of them simple, some of them more complex, that you get to see when you go and you look what other people do. I've done most of my trips as a solo traveller from the organisation I've been on, but a couple we've done, as Jude says, with a couple of other people from the same organisation. And I think that has some benefits if you've got the right people there to make some decisions as you move along. So others get enthused and encouraged and see the same things you see, and you come back with a stronger sense of purpose about a direction, a change in direction on something that you might have seen. So there's my first thoughts on that, Judy.
Yeah, thanks, Al. And I think that is the message I've had consistently over the years since I've been doing the programs with our Australian executives, is those organisations that have taken a colleague, particularly a lot of CEOs take their one up and one down, like a board member, and then some of their ELT team, executive leadership team. And it's being able to bring that message back and discuss it as a group that I actually underestimated when I first started doing this 17 years ago, the power of that inter-organisational collaboration. And the other thing I've just found really interesting about what you said, Al, and I hadn't actually given it a quantitative output before, was that your sales went up by 30%. That's amazing on something so simple like a pet policy. And I know what you've talked to me about that over the years, about bringing in the pets from when we saw it. And indeed, I was there when you saw those pet organisations that had pet policies, but I hadn't realised the impact of that to you financially as an organisation in changing a policy to allow that. So that's quite powerful, isn't it?
Yeah, so about a third of people won't contemplate an RV because they've got a cat or a dog and they won't leave home without it. Yeah. So it was about a 30% increase in people willing to consider it, and it stayed that way. It's difficult to convert something that is not already pet friendly, but we're building new things. And so if we start with that as the premise, people come in with that knowing that it's a pet friendly village and life goes on.
Yeah. That's great. And also anyone who's listening, I'm sure, Alan, there is a Q&A down here at the bottom of our Zoom, so put any questions in, but I'm sure Alan wouldn't mind being contacted if you are considering things like that, because that is also the joy of going overseas and coming back, or going anywhere and bringing messages back about things that you've seen that have worked. Now, Tammy, you go or travel internationally as part of your role anyway, as your CEO of Australia, New Zealand, with your parent company being over there in the UK. So your everyday is travelling internationally, but I know that you've also participated in more formal international programs like SAGE. You joined us in the UK last year. I just wanted to ask you, as a supplier to industry or a vendor organisation, knowing about best practice both in Australia and globally, how important is it to you as a supplier to industry that you know best practice or some best practice ideas that some of your clients here at home might not have been exposed to before? Do you see that as a major importance when you go on a study tour? Because I've said you're going internationally anyway with your work. So what are the benefits of joining another group of Australian executives?
Well, Jude, first of all, thank you for having me. And I think it's fair to say without international study tours, person-centered software wouldn't be in Australia today. So just going back to 2016, I was on a study tour and saw person-centered software in the first time that I walked into. And having worked in the industry for 16 years back then, thought this is going to change the way we evidence care in Australia. Fast forward 2 years, Joe Boylan was on a study tour in the UK and again saw person-centered software. We were actually in the process of bringing the software to Australia at that time, but Joe was able to accelerate that process given her very keen interest in the software and wanting to bring it and help us bring it to Australia. So I think it's very fair to say our little business here in Australia wouldn't be here had it not been for SAGE. So Person-Centered Software Australia owes SAGE a lot, and the way that you do take people internationally and show them the benefits of doing that. I mean, Judy, I've seen it firsthand. You get on the phone if someone needs to be connected with someone in India, Sweden, Canada, Judy's on the phone and she can just make those connections very, very, very quickly. I also think you've got the ability to provide an environment for people to have very respectful conversations, challenging, but very respectful conversations around what we're doing here in Australia and how we can bring those solutions over and to Australia. I think your experience in this industry across, being able to connect all those people, you just can't find that anywhere else. And I think both Joe and Alan touched on, the way that you do curate these cream of the, cream. So we're able to walk in and these CEOs are throwing their doors open to provide the best advice. Something that I found really helpful was the way that providers over there have implemented change, but we're just so happy to share their experience. And because they've gone through all the challenges of implementing this change, telling us, well, this went wrong. So if I was going to do it again, I'd try this. Fantastic. So we're able to get these solutions after someone has made the mistakes and they were really honest about sharing them. I'm fortunate to have the ability to be able to go and visit care homes in the UK and have a look at what they're doing. But the benefit of going with your colleagues from Australia is that you can share all that content on the bus afterwards, at dinner that night, and really kind of flesh all these things out. So that's what I find the biggest benefit for me.
Thanks, Tammy. And for the purpose of the audience, with today's agenda of how do we implement these things or international learnings when we come back home, that is a really valid point, Tammy. People I've caught up with who have come on SAGE programs with me, and indeed there are a number of international programs, but the ones that I have managed and led, which is over 450 Australian executives, I can look at projects around the country and go, I know when that was born and I know when that was discussed on the bus in Copenhagen. And I think the willingness to share, we are competitive, of course we are. We're all there for a purpose, but we're a very small industry in Australia. We all know each other. We're very collegiate. And I've, again, underestimated the power of our ability to share. So what I've found in implementing lateral ideas when we come home, or when delegates who've been on the programs come home, is that if we're at what is ACPAR conference or a Property Council retirement living event, people who've been on a recent tour actually get together and start discussing, and then the conversation widens and it widens again. And so when we're talking about policy or using our own national representatives to take messages to our department, we actually are getting an influx of a couple of people. So Alan, there might be one person saying, never do pets, you can't do pets in Australia. But as you said, what we've come back is, and a few people have seen it, have gone, well, actually you can do it. And this is how I did it. And Alan Waters did it over there at BapCare, and give him a call. So it is how do you implement it? You implement it by changing the messages that it can be done. And I think you just said it's very powerful, the chats on the bus and the chats at dinner. And that's when it all happens. You're not there with your family. You're not there with your friends. You're there with colleagues. You see something, we all get back on the bus. There's often a lot of really healthy debate about that could never happen at home, and somebody on the bus might, or, you know, Alan, you've been on a couple of trips to a number of countries. I know I've heard you say a few times, hang on a minute, that's what I thought 7 years ago, but I've seen this actually in this country and that country and this country, and it can happen. So I think it is very powerful, and the willingness of our international colleagues to share, you're right, Tammy, it is phenomenal, because again, I don't know of any industry in the world that we can all ring each other and we know each other. As you said, you ring someone in South Africa, you ring someone in Kenya, you ring someone in Ireland, Scotland, Sweden, Estonia, and you make a link, and we are all linked. So it is a very small village, our industry, and people are all there for the benefit of the good. You know, we know that. We're all here because we want to make change for our seniors and ourselves. You know, we're going to be seniors. So I think that power is power. Pino, I want to talk to you now, because you and I worked together 20 years ago when we started the idea of SAGE with Thomson Adsett. At that stage, we wanted to be a thought leader in best practice in design. And that very quickly, my background, for those who joined a bit later, my background is nursing. I've had a very wonderful career in health and nursing all around Indigenous Australia, internationally in Malaysia and Dubai. So I've had a fabulous career with clinical care at the basis of it all. And working for an architect company back then, we wanted to make change in design. But then I said, no, why can't we make change in everything? You know, our clinical approach, our workforce and all the rest. So we started SAGE back in 2005. We've done 45 programs since. Anchor Excellence, now manage and home the program, which is brilliant. And Thomson Adsett have come along as our diamond partner. But we always work with the peak associations. We had memorandums of understanding to say this needs to be an industry-led program back for our members and industry to know about it. But how important has it been for you personally? I know it's important for Thomson Adsett, and you can touch on that as well. But I want to know you personally as a senior design. It's no more just about you're an architect, draw us a building, is it?
Absolutely not. And look, again, thank you, Judy, and good morning to everyone. It's really good to be part of this conversation this morning. Absolutely, this whole idea about international experience has been something that is really, I suppose, become both professionally enriching for us. And going back to the early days at Thomson Adsett, we ourselves have been doing work internationally. And were then travelling as well to see other examples around the world. And the idea for SAGE came about when we're saying, well, let's broaden it. And Judy, it's been amazing hands, and you've really been the true custodian of this to develop this as a business. But the learnings that we've had and the conversations that you have, really important a part of it. Has been so much more rewarding by, rather than just having a group of architects travelling together looking at what we know, but having people from care backgrounds, business backgrounds, all the elements that go into this business that we work in, then having conversations together. That's been the truly enriching part of it. And look, we know we could list off many projects that we've been involved in where, say, clients, it's even happened midway through a tour where there's been a call back to Australia saying, pens down, we're changing the brief, we're going to send it on a different direction. Other projects where we've had people go and visit some truly inspirational places in in Europe and in North America. Obviously, we've travelled to almost every continent. But in the process of doing that, the challenge for us has been to come back and then work out how to interpret those ideas into the Australian context. And it's not about saying that that building was this and that and this big and that big and had a pitched roof. It's really, for us, it's about understanding the social models, understanding the business models behind it, understanding how they've implemented a model of care. For the part that we play, it's really about designing the built environment so that those social models and business outcomes and all the good things that we want can actually come through. So that's really our part to play. And the international experience has really been a case of broadening our knowledge, then thrashing out ideas, and both good and bad, but bringing that back in to say, how can we then apply that to what we already, there was some really good stuff that we're doing in Australia, but how can we do that better? Some clients certainly are looking at how can we have a competitive edge in the market, and certainly, Alan, your comment there, just a simple idea of pets is, opens up a market to allow that project to be more successful. Those are the things. So we ourselves have had periods of time where you say, how do we truly quantify what comes out of these? And it's more than you can just say just a list of this is what's happened. It's sort of broad and integrated. And personally, the experience of going on a Sage tour was the collegiate environment was very good. And from a personal level, it was enjoyable, but professionally enriching.
Thanks, Pina. And you've touched on a couple of things there that I want to put out to the panel. Probably you, Joe, you yourself, or Alan, for this question. Have you had any impediments to things that you've wanted to bring back? And, as I said, the topic of today is how have we implemented overseas ideas? And Joe, you've very successfully done that with your healthy ageing approach. Particularly, I know you've looked at that in the Scandinavian countries and the countries that do have a social approach to ageing first rather than a clinical approach. Now, we've talked about the pets, but there's other things that I know you've thought about in housing models. Is it too hard, or has it been achievable?
I'll go first if you like, Al. It's all hard and it's all achievable. I'll just give you an example. Even aside from the housing model, we were really influenced by the high-level group of people you brought to us in the Netherlands, Judy, around the neighbourhood model for community care. As soon as and you gave us such extraordinary exposure to the speakers who gave us, literally gave over all of their intelligence to us. And I was able to go back and speak to the board, and we implemented that model. And that wasn't too hard at all, but it took a lot of work and a lot of change, but it was all for the benefit of the client. If I move on to person-centered software, Tammy, when I saw PCS at the study tour in the UK, it was extraordinary. It just took me, and I've seen a lot of technology, it just really took me by surprise because it was live data and it was cloud-based. And I had to go home and convince everyone that, yes, you could put your data in the cloud. Isn't that true, Tammy? We were used to data centers. So that was very hard, extraordinarily hard, but it paid off. You just have to push through because your focus has to be on the benefits and the outcomes for the people that you serve. And certainly the benefit, one of the best gains was that for PCS was the productivity gain for the staff. Instead of going back to systems that were slow and having to put data in, they were tapping away the tasks on a handset. And it was just so seamless. And And the board have been, they were so excited by this. So that, there are two examples that were hard, but, it is always hard implementing, but it's always hard work that pays off. Easy is not aged care.
Yeah, so I've got an example, Jude, of something we saw, and I can't quite remember where, but I call it the least restrictive model. And it's all about, for people living with dementia, having an environment that is as free from restriction as it possibly can be. And at that stage, we had a nursing home that was with dementia-specific care in it, and it was difficult for people to get outside, and if they could, it was to a fairly small courtyard area. We were in the process of building a brand new aged care home, and we swapped to thinking through this least restrictive thing. And it turned out that we pushed the restriction perimeter right to the very edge. So it's the fence that runs around the place. That's the least restrictive we could get on the site. All doors can be open at any time. There's freedom of movement right around the building. And so we moved the residents from the old place to the new place, and we saw over a 90% reduction in aggressive episodes from residents. And it was just such a powerful example of people wanting freedom of movement. They don't necessarily go outside more often, but the doors aren't locked, so they know they can. And it made such a difference to our staff and to the care of the residents. And I've carried that thinking through to every new project that we're doing about this least restrictive model, and really thinking we don't need locked wards, we don't need locked corridors. There are times when you might want to close it down at night time, but normally you want your perimeter to be as far away from residents as possible, and for them to be able to walk as far as they want to in an unrestricted environment. And we saw that overseas in different places. And that's where that idea came from for me.
And Alan, I think I recall that one. That was in Switzerland, I think, from memory. And you're absolutely right. If that was the project, the same one you and I think, or I'm thinking of, and I'm sure it is, that they had had that challenged in their own country. So I remember that trip, and talking about that was the CEO of that organisation talked to us as a group, a management group or an executive group, about how he himself had to challenge his own country to do that. So bringing that back, and as you said, Alan, having the support of your own organisation to make some changes. I think that's a another very important message too, that, how many times over the years have I been told, oh, you're on a junket? And I often say to people now, well, if travelling without your children and without your family, and on a work where you go home at night at 10 o'clock at night and, kick in to do your Australian work for about 4 hours, have 4 hours sleep and get up the next day and then try and maintain all these knowledge, is a junket. Yes, so be it, it's a junket. But I think what we do is people don't make decisions to go even nationally in Australia to conferences or internationally on these trips lightly. And as I said previously, I've taken over 450 Australian executives around the globe in the last 17, 18 years. I don't think I could find one that didn't bring value for money back to their board. So that to me is the commitment of executives we've got in Australia, and the commitment of those people to take that trip seriously. And what I found is, if a board has allowed a CEO to go, or a board has come with a CEO, or a CEO has allowed a senior executive to come overseas, I'd be hard pressed to find anyone that has wasted that opportunity. I think every single person I've seen, copious notes, copious discussions. I've noticed us all get together at conferences that year. If we're all at the old AXA and Laser conferences, now it's ACPA, but at those conferences, we've all got together and discussed, and some people have said what they've implemented. So I don't think it's as hard as people perceive to make change. People just go, we can't do it. And all the executives I've had travel with me have actually said, well, we actually can do it. But Jo, you've made a very good point. It becomes down to individual drive. And I think the more people that are exposed, or you find value in a commonality, So if you have travelled or you find other people that travel, it's easier to do when you can have discussion or bring at a home level. Alan, you can talk to someone over at Anglicare and go, well, we did that, and, you know, let's get Judy on the phone, or let's talk to Joe. I know, you know, interstate, a lot of the CEOs talk to each other and have made little collegiate groups around that. Faith-based groups have got together and said, okay, let's talk about it. Could we do this as a broader group? Joe, with you, with your Healthy Aging, I know you've got a number of organisations collaboratively together that wouldn't have. But for the purpose of today, for our participants and listeners, again, and this is for all 4 of the expert panel, what do you think are the main focuses we need as a country at the moment when looking at other countries for lateral approaches? Like, what do you think were or are now in this very present environment, be the 8th of June 2023, what needs to be the priority that we're going overseas to look at and bring home and bring back to the, well, we've got a new task force, so to bring back to Tom Simonson to take to the task force to say, this is what other countries are doing. It maybe if we just go around the circle, I'll start with you, Pino, and each one just make a sort of one-line comment of what you think are the most important things we need to be looking at.
Well, really, we are in a time of change within the industry, certainly for the residential aged care sector. I think retirement living is really going through a lot of strong growth, and there is a real emergence of what that market is growing into, certainly now that they're acknowledging ageing in place and within retirement villages. But I think it's really about recognising that there is always space for innovation. We recognise what we do well, but we can do things better. Opportunities like this give us the chance to, you know, have that spark, have that conversation, see something to say, but what if, and how could we, and have those conversations. You know, as a real analogy, you know, how do we build the better mousetrap? You know, there's always, do what we do well, but recognise how we can do certain things better.
Thanks, Pino. Tammy?
I think it's workforce, Jude. For us, you know, we're really looking at how we can nurture and, you know, create a great environment for the people who are on the floor. And we all know that, you know, carers are doing an absolutely brilliant job. We saw that through COVID, and we want to make sure that we're looking after them. And we've actually seen, you know, what they're doing in these other countries to nurture and grow and make sure that we are providing them the environment that they want to work in, that we really focus on workforce at the moment. So that's what we're really focusing on within our business.
Al?
You mentioned the task force. That one's really interesting for me. In New Zealand, when we were there, we learned that they had not built a standalone residential aged care bed for 10 years. So that they just don't do them anymore. Yet we're pressing on with them. And when you dig into it, you look at the funding model that sits behind it, and it's far less generous than the Australian system, where consumers have to pay a whole whack more for their aged care. And so they make a different decision. When you're footing the bill yourself, you're choosing different options. And I suspect the task force that's coming up, it's been just started and will come up with ideas. Inevitably, in my mind, it will lead to consumers having to pay more for aged care into the future. And I think that our consumers will be like others overseas. They'll choose different things. And so I think for me, it will be looking in places like New Zealand and elsewhere that have a higher level of consumer funding and what choices people make. And maybe we don't need the number of residential aged care homes that people think we do, because people won't buy them. They'll buy something else. So that's a really top of mind one for me right now.
It is me too, Alan. I'll talk to that again in a minute. But Joe, what about you? What do you think? Like, if we're going overseas to England in a couple of months, and we'll see you over there, what will you be seeking out as probably one of your main bring homes to your new? You've got a new board, your new CEO.
Yeah. Look, similarly, Alan, I think the retirement living area is a big focus. And one of the things that I did see on one of your SAGE tours, Jude, was when you've got a large retirement living portfolio in one spot, you can also create continuity of care from a group of community packages into, and get the scale going into a retirement living village. And that seems to work extremely well. I'd love to go and see that if it's, I haven't seen it embedded in Australia, and I know there are different places that are doing it. But yeah, so that people don't have to move out of their, say, retirement living unit or home, they can have the scale of a familiar care system providing care into their home. So, you know, I really want to continue to see that sort of thing and look at how we could embed that.
Thanks, Jo. Another thing that I've found over the years with, you know, and I've travelled with all of you, and there's a lot of my colleagues we run into at conferences and things that we have travelled with, and a lot of the discussion is around when you travel overseas, you actually forget, like I forget that assisted living isn't normal in an Australian environment. I've seen it so many times for so many years overseas. Sometimes I get a little bit of a wake-up call when people go, you know, you're sounding like it's brand new, and they go, it is brand new. And I think, well, hasn't it been here forever? So it is a real reminder that some of the innovation we're calling innovation at home has actually been in other countries for many years, particularly those who have the advantage of different tax structures and are very socially demographic approaches to their country's ageing. I do caveat with that. But I do forget, and often when I'm talking to my colleagues in the industry, a lot of them who have become friends because we've travelled together, we do forget that a lot of the things aren't so groundbreaking in the rest of the world. And why can't we do it? And I think, Alan, to your point, you know, co-location versus integration is a very, very big topic that I've talked about for years. I've talked about for years, you know, the balance of clinical care versus social care, and why am I a clinical health problem till I'm 65 and then suddenly I'm an aged care problem, not a clinical problem continued. You know, my sore leg is now under an aged care budget, not a health budget, when it's actually a clinical problem and only one part of my whole being. That's a discussion for another day. But what we did a few years ago with Sage, probably about 9 years ago, we turned our programs to have a focus. In the beginning, early days, it was just we were a group of Australians going overseas to look at everything and come back with our minds filled with brilliant ideas and do everything. So, what's your opinion on that, you know, in terms of looking and going again, like we're now trying to make it a home care focused program where we do see everything, but what is that country? We're trying to, like Ireland, have a very, very home care agenda from their government. We're going to Ireland next year to look at that. We're going to be hosted by the Irish Home Care Association, who had, you know, got the ministers ready to meet with us. Do you think that's restrictive, or do you think that's a better approach to going overseas? If you're going with a group or looking at a group, do you want to go and look at a particular focus, or do you want to go and look at everything? Al, for this?
Yeah, well, where I work and now and where I have worked, we have all of the different things. So all of the tours have got some benefit across all of the service offers, but there are people who specialise in only retirement village or only in home care. So I think specialisation is a good thing for them. They get to see more examples of those things. So yeah, I think the specialisation does add some value to the process for people. If you look at one of these ones that Judy's promoting in the year ahead, and one that really charms with you, you'll know that you're going to get very good value from that, in my view, because there'll be a lot of different things you'll get to see, all related to what you're interested in seeing.
And you know, we know that the purpose of the day wasn't to promote Sage in itself, but I do thank you all for all your very, very complimentary comments. They weren't expected, but I do thank you, because it has been a passion, you know, to be interactive globally. For, as I said, I've been doing it for nearly 30 years internationally, and then with Sage for 18 years, but I didn't expect such lovely compliments from you all. It was, what are the benefits to going international or interstate and with a group of colleagues? So In a minute, I will talk about what's happening next year just as a glance, and anyone listening can contact Anchor or myself about that. But I guess what I wanted to glean from you all, which we had, is that change can be made, and it's not as difficult, as you said, Joe, it's difficult and it's easy. But for the audience, not to put the barriers up before you're given the opportunity to try breaking them down. Because there are different ways to come at a problem. Like you said, Pino, it's not looking at just the architecture anymore. 20 years ago it was. The architects built the building. And I remember coming to Thomson Adsett as a clinical advisor. We were the first sort of health planners back then. There wasn't even a title for us. I was just a nurse who Thomson Adsett had the first foresight to employ to look at a model of care. Back then it was so new to have this cohesive input and holding of hands together to bring a project together. The world has moved that now everybody does that. But as you also alluded, Alan, the more people on your team that are open and come with that positive approach to start with rather than the negative. And I think as an industry around our country, for a few years there, we did find it all too hard. We had the Royal Commission, well, you name it, and it was thrown at our industry. There are so many of us that are still here and are still going and still want to make positive change. And to me, that is absolutely fantastic, because it says the people in our industry want to make that change. So don't give up. But I think the opportunity to see it in practice when we go overseas is a really good thing from a tangible approach, because we can read and research and follow every webinar like we're having today, but every webinar and research paper and say, look, they've done it, but it can't be done. But I think that value for me over the years, intangibly seeing it, and the other thing, being able to follow up people when I come home, to write back to someone in Sweden 4 years later, and Joe, the Buurtzorg program in the Netherlands, how did you do that? I don't want to know your exact model, but I want to know your in principle model. To me, has been the joy and value in being able to facilitate these programs for my colleagues and industry. It is 10:02. We did say we'd allow a little question time. I'll just give 1 or 2 minutes. There hasn't been a question and answer come in, but if anyone's got one in the next couple of minutes, just type it in now and we'll answer. I'll just give that a couple of seconds to see if anything comes through. If it doesn't, I'll preemptively thank the panel ahead of their closing for taking the time. As I said, I've travelled with you all. I've seen what you've done and brought it back. Nothing has been wasted in sending you overseas. We've had a lot of fun together. But that's the other value of this industry. We are a very cohesive, tight industry. We all do know each other, or you know someone who knows someone, or you know the organisation, or you know the history of the organisation. And I said previously, there is absolute power in that. Particularly, we're probably going to go through the biggest change we've had in our industry. A lot of us were around in 2007 when the first Act was being amended for aged care, and we're all still here. I find that unbelievable, but now we're going to have an Act change, and there's so many of us that are still here bringing change and messages. So please, keep fighting the good fight for coming on these programs and seeing things internationally and going home and saying to your organisations and to the industry that it can be done. So I want to thank you all in your different roles, because and even as you said, Joe and Tammy, the cohesiveness you've built out of, provider, supplier and Pino, we're far more embedded in the whole industry than we were 20 years ago or 2007 when the last Act was done. All of us have got far more pieces of the jigsaw in our hand when we put it together. So if we put up the next slide, Kat, just quickly, if anyone's interested, just a quick snapshot of where we are going to go for the rest of the year. We're going off to England in September, looking at what you were talking about before, Joe and Tammy, integrated services. What is the difference between, and we're going to do that again in New Zealand, but in New Zealand, that's more of under an RV assisted living type approach. For England, we're looking at, they've done it the other way around. They've taken their care homes and moved into retirement in New Zealand, they've had the retirement and care integration for many, many years and made that work. In Japan, we're zipping up to look at specifically designed for dementia. We will look at their whole ageing policy. They are the highest population of ageing with Germany in the world. They've had workforce issues. We went a few years ago and we had looked at their robots and how they were using robots to do a lot of their administrative work so they could keep what they call the warm hands for the caring work. So that was an amazing trip. We will see some of that when we zip up to Japan in November. And then next year we'll be off to Ireland and Canada. And one of the most exciting things for those in the retirement village industry is Anchor and Sage are launching our National Retirement Living Study Tour program, where those at middle management and senior management and retirement village will be just travelling around looking at each other, organisations around our own country, which is very exciting. Did I just see, Alan, a question?
I can see in the attendees list a guy called Brad Jones has got his hand up, but I don't know whether we can take that live. I'll pass back to the coordinator there. His hand's gone down now, so.
Okay. All right, well, no questions. If we move to the next slide, Kat, my details are on there. I can direct you to any of our speakers should you want to, or indeed just contact Anchor Excellence and they can direct you to any of the speakers today. I want to thank you all for your senior executives. An hour out of your day is a very big gap. To do things like this. It all is about industry sharing. So thank you for your willingness always to share, and hopefully we'll see you on another program someday, but thank you very much for taking the time. I knew you took it all very seriously in preparing and wanting to make sure that any participant got information out of it, and I think the key message is change can be done and anyone can become the champion of that, and there are global learnings that can be brought back to our own country. So thank you very much, everyone, and please stay in touch.